Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a significant development that tells us a lot about what's really happening inside Russia's energy sector. Russia has just banned the export of aviation fuel until the end of November 2026. And this comes on top of the existing ban on gasoline exports that was introduced earlier this year. Now, at first glance, that might not sound like a particularly dramatic story. But when you dig into the details, this is actually a really revealing move because aviation fuel is one of the most valuable products that Russian refineries produce. And perhaps most importantly, Russia is introducing this ban at exactly the wrong time. The global price of aviation fuel has surged since the start of the war in Iran. Demand remains very strong, supplies have tightened significantly, airlines around the world are facing sharply higher fuel costs, and under normal circumstances, this would be a golden opportunity for Russia. This should be a bumper period. This should be a time when Russian exporters are making exceptional profits. This should be a moment when Russia is cashing in. Instead, Moscow has been forced to slam the door shut on exports, and that tells us something extremely important. The Kremlin appears to be more concerned about running short of aviation fuel at home than missing out on the profits available abroad. And that raises an obvious question. Just how serious are the problems now facing Russia's refinery system? Because this aviation fuel ban comes after months of increasingly successful Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, attacks that are reducing refinery output, disrupting fuel production, and creating growing concerns about domestic supplies. And if aviation fuel is now being protected, could diesel be next? Because if diesel exports are restricted as well, the implications for Russia's economy, the government revenues, and the global energy market would be enormous. Now, before we get into any of the details on this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button and also give me a thumbs up for this video. And I just wanted to remind you that my competition, where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize, is now coming to a conclusion. It's got around about a week left. So if you haven't got involved yet, now's the time to do so. You can scan the QR code on the screen at the moment, or click the link in the description below if you don't know how to scan a QR code, and there's more details at the end of today's video. Now let's start with the most important question. Why aviation fuel? Why has Russia chosen to ban exports of aviation fuel before diesel? Why hasn't it introduced a broader ban covering all refined products? The answer is that aviation fuel is a premium product. It's one of the highest value fuels that comes out of a refinery. It generates really attractive margins. It requires more processing than crude oil, and it's absolutely essential for both civilian and military aviation. Unlike some fuels, there aren't any easy substitutes. Aircraft need aviation fuel. Commercial airlines need it. Cargo operators need it. Military aircraft need it. And if shortages begin to emerge, the consequences become visible very quickly. Flights get cancelled, costs rise, logistics become more complicated, and questions start to be asked. So aviation fuel is one of the products that governments are particularly sensitive about. The fact that Russia is restricting exports of aviation fuel rather than trying to maximize exports tells us that domestic supply concerns have become more important than export profits. And that's where this story becomes really fascinating, because the timing could hardly be worse for Russia. At the start of 2026, aviation fuel was trading at around $90 per barrel. Since the start of the war in Iran, prices have surged dramatically, and it's now trading at around $200 per barrel. They've more than doubled. In simple terms, now under normal circumstances, this would be fantastic news for Russia. Russia is one of the world's largest energy exporters. Higher prices should mean higher profits. Every shipment exported should be generating substantially more revenue than it was generating at the start of this year. This should be a cash machine. This should be a windfall time. This should be one of the most profitable periods Russian fuel exporters have seen for many years. Russia should be taking full advantage of this situation and should be maximizing its exports. It should be selling every available barrel into a market desperate for aviation fuel. Instead, it's done the exact opposite. It has banned exports. Now think about what that tells us. Prices have more than doubled, profit margins have exploded, Demand is super strong, and yet Russia has decided it can't afford to sell any fuel. That suggests domestic supply concerns have now become more important than revenue. And for a country that relies heavily on energy revenues to fund both its budget and the war effort in Ukraine, that is an extraordinary position to be in. In effect, Russia is being forced to walk away from one of the most profitable opportunities it's seen in years. Not because demand has collapsed, not because prices are low, but because its refinery system is increasingly under pressure. And that brings us to the drone attacks. Over the last 2 years, Ukraine has steadily expanded its campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. Initially, those attacks were viewed by many as symbolic, but increasingly they appear to have a genuine impact. Rather than targeting oil wells, Ukraine is focused on refineries, storage facilities, fuel depots, and processing plants. The logic here is simple. Russia can produce all the crude oil it wants to, but crude oil sitting on the ground doesn't power a car, it doesn't power a truck, it doesn't power a tank, and it certainly doesn't power an aircraft. The money is made when crude oil is processed into refined products, and that's exactly where the pressure is now appearing. The latest data shows that Russian diesel production fell by 10% in April, and then it fell a further 10% in May. Now that's not one-off disruption, that is a trend. Refineries affected by drone attacks are estimated to account for more than 30% of Russia's gasoline production and around 25% of its diesel output. These are not small facilities, they're major parts of Russia's refining network. And that's why this aviation fuel ban matters so much. It's not happening in isolation, it's part of a much bigger picture. Russia already has a gasoline export ban in place. Now aviation fuel has been added to the list, and increasingly there are reports that Russia is considering restrictions on diesel exports as well. And if that happens, the implications become even more significant because diesel is arguably the most important fuel in the Russian economy. Diesel powers its trucks, it powers its freight transport, it powers its agriculture, it powers its construction equipment, it powers its military logistics, and diesel exports generate substantial revenues for Russia. So if Moscow decides it needs to restrict diesel exports as well, that would be a major signal that the refinery problems are becoming increasingly difficult to manage. And that's where Russia faces a very uncomfortable dilemma. It can continue exporting fuel and maximising revenue, or it can protect domestic supplies. But doing both becomes increasingly difficult when refinery output is falling. Every barrel kept at home is a barrel that can't be sold. Every export restriction protects domestic inventories but reduces revenue, and every ban effectively confirms that the system is under pressure. Now there is another side to this story because this isn't just bad news for Russia, it's potentially bad news for everybody else too. Russia remains a major exporter of refined petroleum products. When Russian supplies disappear from global markets, buyers need to find alternatives. The countries and companies that were purchasing Russian aviation fuel will now need to source their supplies from elsewhere. That means more competition for available cargoes, it means tighter markets, and potentially higher prices for everyone. The aviation industry is particularly vulnerable to fuel costs. For most airlines, fuel is one of their largest operating expenses. So when aviation fuel prices rise, airlines have two choices: either absorb the cost or pass it on to customers. And historically, passengers tend to end up paying higher ticket prices, higher freight costs, more expensive logistics, and potentially more inflation throughout the global economy. So this story doesn't stop at Russia's borders. The effects will ripple throughout the entire global economy. And the timing of this couldn't be worse because energy markets are already nervous. The war in Iran has created concerns about supply disruptions across the Middle East. Oil prices have risen sharply. Shipping costs have increased. Energy traders are already worried about shortages. And now one of the world's largest energy exporters is restricting exports on one of its most valuable fuel products. That adds another layer of pressure to an already fragile market. And that's why I think this story is much bigger than the headlines suggest. On the surface, it's simply an aviation fuel export ban. But underneath it tells us something important. It tells us that Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure appear to be having an impact. It tells us Russia is increasingly having to choose between exports and domestic supply. It tells us that Moscow is willing to sacrifice export revenue to protect the domestic market. And perhaps most importantly of all, it tells us that one of the world's largest energy exporters is unable to fully benefit from soaring fuel prices because of growing pressure on its refining system. This should have been a period of exceptional profits. Aviation fuel having risen to $200 per barrel is a great news for anyone who's selling aviation fuel. Demand is strong, prices are high, margins are attractive, yet Russia is walking away from that opportunity, not because it wants to, but because it doesn't have a choice. And the big question now is what comes next. Will aviation fuel ban be enough? Will the refinery production recover? Or will Russia be forced to introduce restrictions on diesel exports as well as the attacks continue? Because if diesel is next, then this stops being an aviation fuel story. It becomes a full-blown refined fuel story, and the economic consequences for Russia could be enormous. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.